Most HR teams know their policies need to be reviewed regularly. But the difficult part is not always spotting that a review is needed. The difficult part is knowing what to compare the policy against. Employment guidance changes, employee expectations change, market practice changes, and sometimes a policy that was perfectly acceptable a few years ago can start to feel unclear, inconsistent, or out of step with how the organization now works. In this example, we are going to use ChatGPT Deep Research to benchmark an internal HR policy. I'm going to use a flexible working policy as the example, but the same approach could be used for many other HR policies, including parental leave, sickness absence, hybrid working, menopause support, recruitment, performance management, or expenses. The key difference in this workflow is that we are not simply asking ChatGPT what makes a good flexible working policy. That would give us a generic answer. Instead, we are giving ChatGPT the policy we already have and asking it to compare that policy against current external guidance and market practice. So the internal policy becomes the baseline for the research. First, I'll upload the policy. This gives ChatGPT the internal context it needs. Rather than starting from a blank page, we are asking it to use our existing policy as the baseline for the review. That is what makes this much more useful for an HR team. We are not asking for generic best practice. We are asking, how does our current policy compare with current guidance, market expectations, and practical HR considerations? Now I'm going to ask ChatGPT to carry out deep research using this document as the starting point. I'll be specific about the scope. For this example, I want the research focused on UK flexible working guidance, employment law considerations, and market practice for enterprise employers. I also want the output to be structured in a way that HR can actually use. So I'll ask for an executive summary, key external developments, a comparison against the current policy, areas where the policy appears strong, possible gaps, employee experience considerations, manager enablement issues, risk-rated recommendations, questions for legal review, and a prioritized action plan. Before the research runs, this is a useful moment to review the plan. This is one of the strengths of deep research. It is not just a one-shot answer. It gives us a chance to steer the work before it goes too far. For example, if this organisation only operates in the UK, we can make sure the research does not drift into US or EU employment guidance. If we are especially concerned about manager consistency, we can ask it to focus more heavily on approval processes, documentation, and decision-making criteria. And if the output is going to the HR leadership team, we can ask for a concise executive summary at the top. This is also where we can reinforce the right governance boundaries. For HR policy work, ChatGPT should help identify issues and structure the analysis, but it should not make final legal conclusions. Once the research is complete, we get a structured report rather than a simple answer. This is where the workflow becomes valuable. We can now see how our existing policy compares with external guidance and market expectations. The report might show that some parts of the policy are already strong. For example, the eligibility criteria might be clear, or the process for submitting a request might be well explained, but it may also highlight areas that need attention. Perhaps the policy is less clear on how managers should assess requests. Perhaps the escalation process is vague. Perhaps there is not enough guidance on documenting decisions. Or perhaps the employee-facing language feels more restrictive than current expectations around flexibility. This gives HR a much stronger starting point than a blank-page policy review. The important thing is that the output is not the finished policy. It is a research-backed review pack. HR still owns the decision. Legal still validates legal risk. Leadership still agrees the policy position. But deep research has helped us move much faster from scattered information to an informed review. If the report is long, I can ask ChatGPT to reshape the findings into a cleaner benchmarking table. This is useful because HR policy reviews often need to be discussed section by section. A table makes it easier to see what the current policy says, what external guidance or market practice suggests, where there may be a gap, and what HR should do next. Remember to disable the deep research feature when asking follow-up questions so as not to regenerate the whole report. This table becomes the working document. It helps HR move from broad research into specific policy decisions. For example, it might highlight that the policy explains how employees submit a request, but does not give managers enough guidance on how to assess that request consistently, or it might show that the policy describes the formal process, but does not explain clearly how informal, flexible working arrangements should be handled. These are the kinds of details that matter in practice, because when policies are unclear, managers often fill the gaps themselves, and that can lead to inconsistent employee experiences. Now we can ask ChatGPT to turn the research into something HR can actually act on. The first output gives us the evidence and the analysis. The next step is to create a prioritized action plan. This is where the workflow starts to become operational. Now we have something much more practical. Instead of a long research document, we have a clear set of actions HR can review. Some actions might be quick wording improvements, others might require legal review, others might involve creating manager guidance, employee FAQs, training materials, or a more consistent decision-making process. This is one of the key advantages of using ChatGPT iteratively. The first answer does not have to be the final output. We can keep shaping the research into the format that is most useful for the next step. Next, I'll turn the findings into a one-page summary for the HR leadership team. Senior stakeholders usually do not need every detail. They need to understand the purpose of the review, the headline findings, the main risks, the decisions required, and the immediate next steps. So now I'll ask ChatGPT to reshape the research for that audience. This is a good example of why deep research is more than a search tool. We have gone from an internal policy document, to an external benchmark, to a practical HR action plan, and now to a leadership-ready summary. Each step builds on the last, and because the earlier research included sources and citations, the leadership summary is grounded in a wider evidence base rather than just opinion. Once HR has reviewed the findings, we can also use ChatGPT to draft suggested wording changes. This needs to be handled carefully. We do not want to blindly paste AI-generated wording into a policy. That is especially true where the wording affects employee rights, manager discretion, eligibility, appeals, documentation, or compliance obligations, but it can create a very useful first draft. The important thing is to frame it as draft language for review, not final approved policy wording. This gives the HR team a structured way to move from research into redrafting. It can help speed up the process, but it keeps the right control points in place. HR still needs to decide whether the changes are appropriate, legal still needs to review anything compliance sensitive, and the organisation still needs to follow its normal policy approval process. Now, we are moving beyond policy review and into implementation. This is often where HR policies succeed or fail. Deep research helped us identify the gaps, but the follow-up prompts help us turn those findings into tools managers can actually use. This could become a manager briefing note, a short training guide, or even the basis for an internal FAQ. This is the real value of using ChatGPT deep research for HR policy benchmarking. It is not just researching a topic, it is helping HR move through a complete workflow, from internal policy to external benchmark, to gap analysis, to action plan, to leadership summary, to draft wording, to manager and employee communication. The important thing is that HR remains in control. ChatGPT does not replace HR judgment, it does not replace legal advice, and it does not approve the policy, but it can dramatically improve the quality and speed of the review process by bringing together the evidence, structuring the analysis, and helping HR turn that analysis into practical next steps. For enterprise HR teams, that is where deep research becomes genuinely useful, not as a shortcut around governance, but as a better way to prepare for it.